Hello everyone, Bible believers around the world, and in today's lesson we're going to be covering the war between the descendants of Ham and Japheth in Jasher chapter 7. Now, I didn't think I was going to be back covering stuff about the descendants of Japheth so soon after the big lesson called Japheth, the true father of the Cogsword peoples, but this was too good to pass up, because we're going to learn a lot of things in Jasher chapter 7, and it's going to once again expose a lot of the falsehoods of the One West camps. We're also going to drive home a point even further that we've been doing in past lessons on how Europe for thousands of years was multi-ethnic, and that the black Europeans are not Japheth. Those are the Hamites and scattered Israelites. And the book of Jasher is going to show that once again and bring that point home. We're also going to learn something that's going to be relevant to modern history, and we're going to see that this war may play a role in why the descendants of Japheth today have such spite and anger for the continent of Africa and the Hamitic peoples. Let's get started. Okay, we are now in Jasher chapter 7, and we're going to start reading at Jasher chapter 7 and verse 34. Verse 34, and when Nimrod was 40 years old, at that time there was a war between his brethren and the children of Japheth, so that they were in the power of their enemies. And Nimrod went forth at that time and assembled all of the sons of Cush and their families, about 460 men. And he hired also from some of his friends and acquaintances, about 80 men. And B gave them their hire, and he went with them to battle. And when he was on the road, Nimrod strengthened the hearts of the people that went with him. And he said to them, do not fear, neither be alarmed, for all our enemies will be delivered into our hands, and you may do with them as you please. Verse 37. And all the men that went were about 500, and they fought against their enemies and destroyed them and subdued them. And Nimrod placed standing officers over them in their respective places. Okay, let's hold the phone right here. So Nimrod just beat the descendants of Japheth, and he put standing officers over them in their respective places. So we have African security guards, so to speak, standing over the descendants of Japheth in their respective places, in their lands. So now we have Africans in Europe watching over the descendants of Japheth. And we need to understand this, because when you go to the Google AI, it tells us that Nimrod was born approximately 4,000 to 4,200 years ago. So when people come forth and like, yeah, what about those African remains that were found in England or whatever? Well, those ancient black remains fit this perfectly, because now we know that there were Africans in Europe watching over the descendants of Japheth 4,000 years ago. So those ancient black skeletons are not the descendants of Japheth, but are descendants of Ham. Fits this perfectly. So we're learning again that with the history continues to show us that Ham and also Jacob have had a history for a very long time being in Europe, and that these blacks that the remains are being dug up for are not Japheth, but are Hamitic and Shemitic peoples. Now, the thing about this is the European scientists won't tell you this. They won't tell you that these are Hamitic remains of a Hamitic army that beat them thousands of years ago. Because one thing you need to keep in mind is that the people who are teaching these doctrines, these British scientists, they're atheists. So they can't say things about scripture and why things are the way that they are. So they have to come up with a lie about evolution and try and justify things that way. But we already are seeing how this makes sense with what the book of Jasher is saying. So we have Africans keeping an eye on the descendants of Japheth, ruling over them 4,000 years ago. So what happens when one of those African guys passes away and his remains are still in Belgium, and now it's 4,000 years old, and the modern Japhites don't know how to explain it with evolution? Let's keep going. And he took some of their children as security, and they were all servants to Nimrod. Okay, so now we have Japhites, Caucasians, being servants to Nimrod, the African man. And I want to bring this up because another brother brought this out. And he brought this out and he talked about the resentment that so many Caucasians have for the continent of Africa and Japheth's envy of Ham. We learn about that in Jubilees, how Japheth was envious of his brother Ham and what he had. And now we're seeing Japheth try to fight Ham, but he got his butt kicked. And now he's serving Africans. And then we look at modern history. And this is a point I brought out in the Unmasking the Edomite series on how we know the white man is Japheth and not Esau. Because Japheth has had a deep, thick hatred for Ham and Jacob. If he was Esau, he would love Ham because Esau and Ham were tight. But Japheth hated Ham. So you look at this and the embarrassment of Japheth getting beat by, as what the descendants of Japheth call Africans now, tribalism barbarians. They got beat by these tribal barbarians, and now they're serving Africans. You look at the modern history of it, and Japheth has tried his best to destroy Africa. No matter it be France, Britain, America, all of these Japhetic nations have fought so hard to destroy Africa. They've arguably fought as hard to destroy Africa and African people, just like they've done Israel. They pushed into South Africa and just completely subdued the people there and now claim the land. There was a point in African history where the majority of the continent was ruled and owned by white people. The native Hamitic peoples have been beat. So throughout history, the white man has always set his eyes on conquering and taking over Africa. And seeing this happen right here in the book of Jasher, it makes it look like that all of the stuff that's happened in Africa in modern history was revenge. Okay, revenge for this. Let's keep reading. And he took some of their children as security, and they were all servants to Nimrod and to his brethren. And Nimrod and all of the people that were with him turned homeward. Okay, so they turned homeward. So that means they went somewhere else. That's what he said. He put, officers, in their respective places. And when Nimrod had joyfully returned from battle, so Nimrod was happy. Usually you're not happy coming back from war, but he was joyfully returned from battle. Returned from battle after having conquered his enemies, all his brethren together with those who he knew before assembled and make him king over them. And they placed the regal crown upon his head. Okay, so there's a lot to break down here. So Nimrod's African army defeated the children of Japheth, and they put soldiers, officers, over them in their respective lands. So now we know we had Africans, providing security in the lands of Japheth, which is, Europe. So we know that. And we also know that he took some of them to be servants. Okay? So that is very interesting indeed. Alrighty, we learned a lot back there in the book of Jasher in chapter 7. But before we move away from this lesson, there's something I'd like to clarify. Because some people do not have the best reading comprehension and they just jump all over the place. The word used for what Nimrod and his African army did to the descendants of Japheth is subdued. He subdued them, and then he put soldiers in their lands to watch over them and keep them in line. Just like what's happened to Israel and America and all of the other places we've been. Just like I used the analogy in the Unmasking the Edomite series, it was a Barack Obama situation. The modern people of Europe, the Caucasians, are descendants of Japheth. They're not Ham, I don't want anyone trying to get that. I'm like, oh, so you're saying that they're Ham? No, they're not Ham. Ham ruled over them for a time. Ham subdued them. Subdued them don't mean exile and that you kick them out and you replace them. That's the false One West Camp doctrine that they try and do with Zepho. They were subdued, just like the black man of America is subdued by Japheth right now. We are under his rule. They're not Israelites ruling over us. They're Japheth Caucasians ruling over us. So I wanted to clear that up and make sure that was clear, because sometimes people have bad reading comprehension. Nimrod and his African army subdued them, and he put soldiers in their lands to keep them in line. When there was no replacement theology, and the Caucasians are not Hamites who put Japheth's name on themselves. That didn't happen.